begin. Okay, again, namaste everyone. Thank you for being with us from wherever you are. We actually had people register from all over the world, which is wonderful. And I see some non-Indian names as well. So of course, the topic is of great interest. And we have with us today Professor Himanshu Roy. And to give him a quick introduction, Professor Roy is affiliated with Delhi University. He's a professor of political science. He was the Atal Bihari Vajpayee Senior Fellow, as well as the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library Fellow. And he has a number of books under his belt. He's here to talk about his latest, which is the Political Thought in Indic Civilization by Sage. And his other works include A Colonial History of India, Patel, Political Ideas and Policies, of course, and Sardar Patel, that is with Sage Publications, State Politics in India, Indian Political Thought, Indian Political System, and Secularism and its Colonial Legacy in India. And one of his first works, Peasant in Marxism. And of course, Dr. Roy has been published in many peer-reviewed journals. And with that, Indology Academy would like to welcome Professor Himanshu Roy. Namaste, Dr. Roy.
Thank you, Anjali.
Yes. To start off, let's see how this book idea came about, right? Like what was inside you that had to be taken out, like in a creative format. And then after kind of getting into that, you can begin your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Anjali Kanozia and Indology Academy. When I began my teaching in Delhi University in 1990, I was told to teach this paper called Colonialism and Nationalism in India, which was part of the political science paper at graduate level, honors level in Delhi University. So that's how my interest in the colonial history and then the pre-colonial history began. Subsequently, in 1995, Indian political thought paper was introduced in Delhi University. And again, I was asked to teach this paper. So from colonial history, I moved into the pre-colonial history. And that's how I came to learn about Tiruvalluvar, Vemana, then Sankardev. I read about Tulsi as a part of the academic paper, then Kabir. So, which were not part of, and in many of the higher academics still at the post-grad level in Delhi University or at the research level, we do not teach our own Indic civilizational history. That's something very tragic. We do not teach these say literary figures, their political ideas. So when I ventured into, I had to rely more on these literary writings. And there are, on Kabir in particular, there are two broad schools in Delhi University in JNU. So this was one. Then we read the political ideas of Tulsi, the political ideas of Tiruvalluvar, etc., etc. So that's how finally, and regarding this book, Political Thought in Indic Civilization, this is all part of the prequel and the sequel, the history book that has been published by Routledge recently on 21st December on the international edition. That was part to come earlier, much earlier, which has been jointly edited with Professor Javed Alam, who teaches history in Jamia Millia Islamia. Then another book which is coming, which is under the copy editing, part of the copy editing process now, that Social History of Indic Civilization, which was to be part of this political history, but because of the marketing reasons and should not become bulky, etc., the publishing house says, suggested me to make it into two parts. So the sequel, the social thought in Indic civilization, is in the process of being printed, and I hope in another 2 months' time it should be into the market. So that's how I had a, say, 27, 28 years or 30 years of work on this colonial history and the pre-colonial history. And I could say Professor Avdesh Sinha, with whom we have a joint paper in colonial history book, and then part of the couple of other projects, state politics in India. That's how my work has been. And then, of course, I could say Rajiv Burma. Thanks, Rajiv, for all this. So Anjali, yeah, back to you.
No, thank you, sir. I mean, that is wonderful. And we will just let you tell us about the book in the format, whatever format you want to take us through. So we'll let you present, and then after that, we'll open it up to questions and answers. And those in the audience, if you want to put your questions down in the chat, I will take them, and then we can do that towards the end. Thank you all. Back to you, Professor Roy.
Yeah, see, the methodology that I have used for this work, let me say that we began a proper workshop, and we had 4 workshops in different parts of India, 2 in Delhi, to arrive at a standardized pedagogy, what exactly we want. The group of the people, my colleagues who may be part of the this discussion, Professor Kundan Singh, who is in Sophia University, USA. Then Dinesh here in Gwalior, Neeraj here, Jha in Gwalior, Vijaya Lakshmi Barara, then Vijaya, so colleagues in Delhi University, Santoshi, Bhuvan Jha, etc. So we sat down together. Nandini Bhattacharya Panda from Calcutta. So we sat down together 4 years ago in 2016-17 for the first time, and then discussed about it theme by theme, chapter by chapter. And for this book, we have been working for the last 4 years, and then my own readings for the last 25, 30 years helped all this to arrive at our objective. And the objective was to decolonize the entire historiography, to indirectly rewrite the history objectively without being biased by or influenced by Orientalism, Westernism, colonialism, and even the post-colonialism that we found it in 70s and 80s and 90s, etc. The methodology that we adopted for this is to consult, or was to consult, local literature. For example, Abhang literature from Maharashtra. Then Lingayat literature. My colleague Prakash Desai, he teaches in Goa University. He has contributed a chapter. Then another of my colleague Rahul Tripathi in Goa University, he contributed a paper on the decolonization process. So local literature, Braj, Awadhi, in which Tulsi wrote. So these kind of local literatures, including the Arabic and the Persian in the medieval times, we'll discuss about it. Then the Asamiya literature written by, say, Sankar Dev. So we consulted these literature, and then of course the Sanskrit. Then the foreign travelers who have been coming to India for centuries. Francois Bernier, who was in Aurangzeb's court, then Tavernier. So people have been coming, Fahian. So people have been coming here for centuries. So their writings, which has been translated, Bartolomeo, an Austrian father, a Carmelite missionary who had come around 1780s, stayed in Malabar for 13 years. Then the factory records, the different companies of Europe which came to India, and their records are quite substantive to come to certain conclusions. They have given very apt observations regarding the Indian history. before the British occupied us or made us colony or had the colonial administration, they formed their own state. These factory records, then excavations, etc. So these are the sources that we consulted for the writing of this book. Now let me begin with what Hegel had to say. And he is reflecting, you know, Hegel was a German philosopher, a guru of Karl Marx. So I begin with Hegel, and it's interesting to see, and he is reflecting the very popular notion that was prevalent in Europe. He says that about India, India is a land of wisdom. And again, he's saying India is a land of desire. This is very interesting. And then he says, India is treasures of nature. And then from here, after 1784, 1786, when the Asiatic Society was formed, and in a very organized way, in a planned way, these 38, 40 military officers, in the evening at 7 o'clock, in the chamber of the Supreme Court, during the dinner time at 7 o'clock, 7 p.m., they decided which of the manuscript, Indian manuscript, is to be published, translated and published. So the military officers, the judges and others, the British, not the Indians, who decided which manuscript to publish. And then they call us, in beginning from Hegel, he says, Hindus have no history. Just look at the contradictions and the dichotomy. The man who is saying that India is known for the land of wisdom and India is the land of the desire, and therefore all the invaders and the looters have been coming to India. Remember, it has been the land of desire. And then he says that Hindus have no history. From the most ancient times, I'm reading out Hegel, I'm quoting him. From the most ancient times downwards, all the nations have directed their wishes and longings to gaining access to the treasures of this land of marvels. This is Hegel. And then Hegel says that Hindus have no history. The Brahmins are immoral. They have no conscience in respect to truth. He says Hindus are cunning, cheating. He's using the word, and I'm quoting, only I'm quoting Hegel. The word he's using is cheating, stealing, robbing, murdering. Hindus lack the power of comprehension, as they have no self-consciousness. They are incapable of writing their history. This is all citations from Hegel, the same Hegel who is giving a very popular idea of Indic civilization. And then gradually, he, in the classrooms in 1820s, 1870s to his students, is narrating. And remember, at that point of time, the Bengal Suba had become the part of the British administration. From 1757, we find that the British had taken over. So this is, in a very organized, systematic way, they have begun distorting Indian history. And what these military officers and the judges and the civil servants are writing about the Indian civilization, that's being reported to the British Parliament, from the British Parliament. The data is being used by Karl Marx in his writings on India. It is becoming part of the Orientalism, Oriental education, European education, etc. And look what we were before they seized the power. Paulino da Bartolomeo, this is an Carmelite Austrian missionary who comes to Malabar, stays there for 13 years from 1776. Book called A Voyage to the East Indies. And there he says that the elementary education was universal. I'm giving you the details. Education, I'm citing him, Bartolomeo. Education with them, that is Indians. He's writing in that book, A Voyage to East Indies. It was published in 1795 from London. He says, education with them is an early and important business in every family. Mind the words. He is talking about the universal education. It means, look at the contemporary narrative of caste and gender. It becomes infructuous. It has no relevance. The moment he says that education is universal, it's a business in every family. Each family, the girls and the boys, they are going to a school at the average age of 5+. And they are reading 4 things there. This part, the Malabar where he stayed, was yet not part of the colonial rule, because the colonial rule becomes from 1757 subsequently onwards. Punjab was the last to join around 1845-47. Then he says, women are taught to read and write. You remember the British narrative about the gender discourse and the caste discourse in India? And here is a father who is saying that women are taught to read and write. And the 4 things were the Lipi Gyan, the Bhasha Gyan, means the language and the script, mathematics, and the moral education. These 3 were compulsory. Compulsory means it was taught universally across different regions of India. Elementary mathematics, Akshar Gyan, that is the Lipi, that is the scripts, and the language. And the 4th was slightly different. One, of course, was the moral education through epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, and the other local epics. There was more than 300 Ramayans. Not only Ramayana, Balmiki Ramayana. So such a wide diversity, wide democratic traditions, pluralism. And look what the teachers were doing. I'll come to the Brahmins. These are the caste narratives. That's very important to understand. The Brahmins were the scholars. He is saying that on the Brahman path, those who have completed their schooling at the age of 12 or 13, they are moving to the Brahman path. Means they are becoming a professional scholar for higher studies. And they were called Upadhyayas, Mahamohopadhyayas, Mahamukhopadhyayas, Achar. The different regions in different language has these designations. And these were thorough secular designations, academic designations, professional designations. It was not a surname for Brahmanical something. For example, we in the professional historiography, we use the word Kanungo, Bakshi. And then we use the word, say, Rana, Rawat, which have become in course of time titles or surnames. But these were the official posts, administrative posts, professional posts, which subsequently in course of 9-10 generations of the colonial administration, when the growth stopped, the economic powerhouse that India was, say 1/4 of the global GDP, approximately, two different estimates, 23.5% and 24.5%, 1/4 of the GDP was being held by India. That French courtier who was in the court of Aurangzeb, he's saying that bullion pours into India. Nothing goes out of India except for purchasing horses and some precious stones. People come here to buy spices and textiles, and the bullion is being poured into. He is talking about important point. He's saying this Austrian Carmelite. It is to these elementary schools of India he's talking about. It is to these elementary schools that the laboring classes in India owe their education. It means the laboring classes were not denied education. That itself rules out the kind of narrative that colonial history and the post-colonial history built up subsequently over the centuries. And then he says that which in the like manner was partly available for labor in Europe and which was imitated from India. The kind of education that the British initiated in the 18th, 19th century was an imitation. They had imported it from India. The kind of educational system that was so developed that the British at the earliest stage, they imported it from India. Interestingly, he is citing this Bartolomeo, the Austrian father, 250 years before him, that is in 1623. Later back home from Malabar, talking about the same mode of education in India. These are something very interesting aspects of the education. And this is not something new. I'll give you some data that in the inscriptions of Raja Raj Chola II, a similar kind of educational system has been discussed. This is around, it's the inscription which was around 1068 AD. It's talking about in a village in Tamil Nadu near Pondicherry. It's talking about 260 students in a school where there are 19 teachers. This is so interesting. So this is the continuation of the Indic civilization in the matter regarding education. Universal elementary education, nothing to do with something Brahmanical and caste and the gender narrative that subsequent colonial history and the post-colonial history build up. And look how it has been substantiated by the British report itself. 80,000 schools in Bengal alone. And this is the report from 1830s onwards to 1856. The 3 presidency towns and in the Punjab, the different reports that has been filed to the British Parliamentary Committee, they are talking about the colonial administration. Now I'm talking about that 80,000 schools in Bengal alone. And if you combine Bengal and Bihar, then there are 1 lakh schools in 1830s that it's talking about. So that's how the education system has been in India that I told you for the past almost, before the British came, 1000 before the British came, for 1000 years. Now look at how the teachers were paid. There was nothing like a state funding education. And again, I am citing this Bartolomeo. He says that the average entry level of the child is around 5 years that we discussed. The teachers received 2 pannam from each of his pupils for every 2 months. This is one simple information that he is giving. Then he is saying that there are students who are not able to pay, but they are students. They are not being forced to leave the school. The teachers are teaching voluntarily as well. So it's a voluntary education as well as it's a universal education. There is no state funding. There is no jamindari funding. It depends on the society. It's a society-centric education. It's universal. So this is one very interesting aspect. Now let me come to the health. This is another important aspect. Can you imagine that today we understand barbers as something, or we consider them as something like lowly profession? Before the British came, they were the surgeons. And what we considered as gardeners, they were the physicians. Imagine the situation for 190 years in Bengal, in other provinces of India, which means 10 generations. These surgeons, these doctors, these physicians, and these compounders, they were reduced to a different kind of professions. I'm reading it out from something, the data that I'm giving you to. Ayurveda was a developed branch of medicine and surgery with hospitals, doctors, and nurses. The recent discovery of inscriptions on the walls of Venkatesh Perumal Temple, a Chola temple built in 1069 AD, constructed by Veer Rajendra Chola at Tirumukuddal near Kanchipuram, Chennai, was a 15-bedded hospital, just like AIIMS, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, that we have in Delhi, or any government hospitals, which is hospital as well as research centers, as well as training for the students. It says 15-bedded hospital established in 1069 AD. And there are around that Chennai area 4 temples. I'm giving you the names. The inscriptions give details of medical procedures, salary paid to doctors in the form of paddy proportionate to their work, 19 herbal drugs used for treating fever, lung disease, and dropsy. It was a medical hospital cum college where the students stayed and studied, and the staff of the temple and the public were treated, because this hospital was within the premise of the temples. This is very interesting, as we understand temples as only linked with the religion, something rituals. What the British did, that they deliberately under a plan mixed up these academicians and the priests and called them Brahmins. The priests were different, who looked after the temple rituals, and the research scholars, the higher academicians, the school teachers, because they were part of this Brahmin profession, combined deliberately, and they were called exploiters. That Hegel is talking about lacking comprehension of history, lacking self-consciousness, etc. So here it says that the temples was the center of the hospital as well as the dance center. You remember the Devdasi words. And a 15th, 16th century Narhari Mehta from Gujarat, a saint poet, a contemporary of Kabir or Tulsi, he is coining a word, Devdasi Harijan, coining a word Harijan for the Devdasi of Andhra Pradesh temples. And these were the centers of professional, now the classical dance. It was an Ayurvedic cum Siddha college hospital, which was then known as Atul Salai, Atular Salai. Series of such centers were functioning around such temples, such, for example, as in Tanjavur, Sri Ranganam, etc. And this is not something 1069 AD. Fahian had observed about the functioning of hospitals in Patliputra and in other parts of India in the 5th century AD. When Portuguese came to Goa, they found the similar things. My colleague Shankar, who is associate professor in Delhi University, he has written an excellent paper on this medicine. And you will find it in the book. And this 5th century AD, where the patients were examined, housed, and treated. It means a professional hospital, cum training center, of which Fahian is talking about. And remember, it resembles the description that Charak had mentioned about it in his book, Charak Samhita. Look at this Indic civilization and the continuity of this beauty. You will never find such kind of geology in the professional historiography. The professional historians, you will not find such kind of analysis. Whereas we have tried in this book and in my earlier book, interdisciplinary studies, where the psychologist is there, where the man of literature is there, Balaji Ranganathan from Central University, Gujarat. Professor A.C. Sinha is there, sociologist. Historians are there, Shankar, Bhuvan, and of course, Javed Alam. And then, of course, political scientists are there. Santoshi, another historian who has worked on the Asiatic society itself and modern history. And then the political scientist, as I said. So 5, 6 disciplines of social sciences and humanities have transcended their disciplinary perspectives to present a holistic analysis of the Indic civilization, looking at objectively, using or taking benefit of the contextual aspects. We cannot compare the contemporary society, or from the perspective of the contemporary society, we cannot look at the history. We have to contextualize the history, but of course, in comparison to Europe, definitely. As India has been the trading hub of the world economy, so the world came to India for the trade, and the Indians went to the trade to the Arab world, to the Greek world, and to other parts of the world. Southeast Asia, you remember Bali and Sumatra, where the temples are there. Then Cambodia, Indonesia, Central Asian republics, and even Saudi Arabia, where Makkah, Medina is there. Ramdhari Singh Dinkar, in his book Sanskriti Ke Char Adhyay, talks about that it was a Hindu temple, and the Shivlings were there. I have cited it in my book, in this book, which is being discussed here. And then it says again that to continue with this health, it resembled the description, as I said, regarding the Charak Samhita. And it is equally interesting to note that the so-called contemporary barbers and gardeners and potters were once professional doctors and surgeons. And in 1795 in Pune, the British have recorded it, that how using the skin of the forehead, the nose of a British soldier was reconstructed. So the British themselves saw it practically in their own case when a Sepoy got his nose was in the war decapitated. Now let me come to the grassroots democracy. This is something very interesting. I'll be citing it, this inscription from Raja Raj Chola about the village life. The inscription says, and there are others, there are subsequently other documents that substantiate this inscriptions, which is saying that do not let the professional castes to go out of the village, give them incentives. Today we are talking about the castes. A word from casta, derivative of the word casta, which is a Portuguese word. Whereas we had different professions. Al-Biruni is saying that he had observed when he had come around 11th, 12th century, 10th century AD, that there were intermarriages between the different professional groups. Here at the grassroots democracy, and which is linked with the civic freedom or the individual liberty, each family has a Kul Devi in India, we all know. A Kul Devi, a Kul Devta, that is family deity. A village deity. It can be of any gender, male or female. We did not make any discrimination as such. Prakash Desai in his paper says that from Lingayat alone, there were 59 saint poets, social reformers as well as saint poets from one Lingayat area. Then Maharashtra has another series of the so-called Dalit and women saint poets. And from 10th, 11th, 12th century AD onwards. And that too from the Konkan region. This is something very interesting. And here we find that in the village that I am citing about the inscriptions, a pond is to be cleaned for the hygienic reason. From the age of 18 to 80, everyone is participating. Those who are physically, who can contribute, what we call it, Shramdan. So the whole assembly is taking a collective decision, as it used to happen in many of the villages across India for centuries. Some of us may be witnessed in 1940s, 50s, 60s, etc. But of course, with the passage of time, many things died down. Simply one family whose profession was of leather tanning, and it is mentioned in the inscription, and it's written in Tamil. So it says that for the hygienic reason, let him not participate it. He was willing to participate, but let him not participate it for the hygienic reason. As for example, in contemporary Corona times, for the hygienic reason, we maintain physical distance. Colonial historiography and the post-colonial historiography created it something as untouchables. Whereas the person with a profession of leather tanning had a very good income, because the villagers required the leather to use it in their everyday use. For irrigating their fields, we required that leather bags. If you are aware of the village life, that earlier leather bags in 60s, 40s, 50s, 70s, leather bags were used, huge leather bags, 2 people using it to irrigate their lands. So the man who was for hygienic reasons, and this is the inscription says that let's request him not to participate in the cleaning of the water tank for the hygienic reason, which has a very good income according to the standard of the time. The foreign travelers who are coming, and now the historians are saying that maximum 30% of the Hindus, who they were the part of the Darbar of Aurangzeb. So the maximum number of elite, Hindu elite, was 30% participated in the, or he was made the elite into the Darbar of Aurangzeb. It means in the pre-Aurangzeb period, the number of Hindu elite participating or part of the Darbar was much or far lesser. And these are their observations. We'll come to it when we come to the polity, but this grassroots democracy is another which is quite interesting. And regarding this civic freedom that we are talking about, that we, as I said, that each family, each village had its deity without any discrimination, so that gender and the caste itself was at such the kind of discrimination that we talk about today, the narrative that we have. And remember the kind of economy that we had, particularly the coastal economy, the entire coastal economy of India. It was such a mobile economy, such a mercantile economy, and there was so much of social mobility, which constant upgradation of their technical skills, that we cannot think of unless we read it from the diverse sources. And therefore, because of those readings and the excavations and the inscriptions and the different sources and the different disciplines that we have been participating and discussing about it, we find that even the narrative about the gender and the caste is infructuous, because it was deliberately created, as we have been talking about the Brahmin being demonized. We were projected as illiterate, whereas we had the universal education. And let me slightly go through some of this 45-46 minutes. I'll conclude with some interesting facts. Recently, Ali Athar edited a book exploring medieval India through Persian sources. It has been published by National Mission for Manuscripts. You remember, Atal Bihari Vajpayee had set up a national mission for the translation of the many of the manuscripts, Sanskrit, Persian, etc., which has not been, and local literature, which have not been translated. Under this rubric, there is a chapter in this book written by Rizqullah Mustaki. And he talks about Parda being introduced by Sikandar Lodi for the high-class ladies of the harem. And it's a common logic that if a working woman working in the fields cannot have a veil on the face and she can work in the fields, it's a common sociological observations. So basically, whatever that came among the Hindu elite in particular, that was confined to a very tiny segment about which Raja Ram Mohan Rai began to talk about from 1815, 1818, 1820 onwards. And the recent data about Calcutta division from 1815 to 1827-28 says that in Banaras, there were hardly 125 satis. In a place like Banaras, there were only 125. And still the impression was sent throughout the India during the colonial regime that it's a land of sati. We kill our women. Look at the projections. Look at the imagery that's being sent. The purpose is that the new ruling class wanted a new history. The British wanted to rewrite history in order to rule, in order to project us that we are the bunch of murderers that Hegel is talking about. We are the bunch of cheats. We only have Manusmriti. Lot many of the people do not know that Rig Ved alone, I'm not talking about the 4 Vedas, the Rig Ved alone had 21 versions. 21 versions. There are more than 300 Ramayanas. There are more than 6 Smritis. And since they deliberately translated and published it, Manusmriti, and we imitated it, we gave a consent to their supremacy. Since we gave consent to their supremacy, we accepted that they are dominants. We accepted their rule. We accepted their hegemony. But most unfortunately, Anjali, the tragic part is this, that this historiography continues in India post 1947. And here we are at least attempting a group of 25, 30 colleagues from all across India, from different disciplines, to dismantle this colonial historiography. So with this, I end up, and thank you, and back to you, Anjali.
Professor Roy, if you have anything more that you absolutely want to share with us, you can. I think we can take a little bit of extra time. And one of the things that I want to put out there is if you can kind of elaborate how modern day political science students, if they want to take up this type of research, where to go, how to start, just kind of a little bit of a guideline is something that if you can share that with us, please. And whatever else you want to finish, we don't want to rush you.
See, we need to transcend the boundary of the disciplines. We in political science focus on public policy, then we focus on party system, federalism, parliament, cabinet, and such kind of institutions. We do not focus on the pre-colonial thinking. Even the political thought that we teach in India, we teach on Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, the three, the dominant. And then in the state universities, we teach about Lala Lajpat Rai or Tilak, etc. But rarely do we go on the political ideas or philosophy of these people that we discussed, say about Tiruvalluvar. We were unaware of Tiruvalluvar, Narayan Guru in Delhi. Only the Malayali people, the Kerala University might have in their syllabus, or the Tamil Nadu might have in their syllabus. Shankar Dev might have been taught in Assam University, Guwahati, but we were unaware about as part of the academic curriculum in Delhi or JNU. We do not teach these people. They are our part of the civilizations. We need to teach students like this. Then rarely we teach about the dance, the music, the kind of excavations that's going on. Still, the Aryan invasion theory is there. Whereas the recent researches on, say, in Rakhi Gadhi that I'm tracking, and the different journals, papers that's being published in American journals, that straightway says that this is useless, this has no relevance, this was a concocted, created under a planned way design by the British. The simple reason was that the India has been ruled by the invaders, the looters. We came here, so what's new about it? And therefore, in order to justify, they began with the Aryans. They fragmented us psychologically, as if there was nothing like a cultural homogeneity or cultural unity. We were measured anthropologically. We were divided into different height, faces, color, caste, etc. So each human being became a separate identity. We were not treated as Indians, but separate identity, fragmented. And they taught us under the rubric, they taught us that we are Indians. They tried to make us Indians. Whereas Narhari Mehta is talking about Andhra Pradesh temples, Devdasi, or Shankar is constructing temples all across India. And there are hundreds of examples. Shankar Dev in Assam in 15th, 16th century is meeting Kabir, coming to Mathura. In his writings, there an impact of Braj language, Braj script. So it has been civilizational. There has been similarities. There has been learning from each across. These need to be taught. This is the idea of India. The idea of India did not come with the British. Rather, they learned it from us from 1603 when they first docked up in Surat. A poor country had nothing much to offer, nothing much to eat. unfortunately conquered an economically much developed country. And that has been the tragic part of the Indic civilization. A force of 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 marauders coming, whether Babar or someone else, and defeating us with a much larger force. This is something very tragic part. And the Trevenier is observing in 17th century that, and he's pitting us, that a handful of princes are ruling on the multitudes who are poles apart, because Al-Biruni is saying, and I'm reading it out. Al-Biruni says in the book India, which has been published by Government of India 1983, National Book Trust, that's called Kitabul Hind. And it says they, means the Hindus, differ from us, that is Muslims, in everything. And the same Al-Biruni is talking about intercaste marriages, which is says common among the different professional groups, different crafts and the professional groups. And then he says again that Mahmud utterly ruined the prosperity of the country. So these are the observations which equally needs to be told, because definitely there has been contribution of these people who came from outside, technological contributions. The kind of polity that they established was Persian in a structure that was not organically evolved, that was imposed from the top, whether the British colonial rule, and before that, the people who came, the Muslims who came, the kind of polity that the structure that they imposed on the Indic civilization was an alien one. And the historians are aware of it. Just one example I cited was maximum 30% of the Hindu elite becoming part of the Darbar of Aurangzeb. So the political languages of Islam, the kind of Arabic script that they are using, the Persian language that they are using, not the local vernaculars or the Sanskrit, the standard one, which was being replaced by English in 1835-36. So definitely technology they are bringing, there is no doubt about it. But many of these ruling classes, the ruling elite, imposing their own views, their own rule. And partly they are also rewriting the Indic civilizational history. Just imagine that the Sanskrit tolls around 1757, the British recorded was much less, 350 approximately, whereas the madrasa was around approximately 700 as per the recordings of British authorities in around 1757, only in Suba, Bengal. So that has been going on. So anything else?
Yes, sir. A couple of questions have come in. I'll take them in the order of how this is progressing. One question is the inscriptions of Uthiramur temple in Tamil Nadu has inscriptions of bicameral democratic system of governance about 1200 years ago, which is about 500 years before the Magna Carta gave the Charter of Freedom. And it says, can Professor Roy please illuminate us about local democratic traditions in Bharat?
See, these there are two ways to understand this. Once the inscriptions that I discussed about it, whether of the Raja Raj Chola. The second way to look at it is these kinds of different so-called reforms movement led by the different social reformers of the saint poets. I have been taking names of Shankardev, for example. The Namghar in Assam. Namghar in Assam is, you can say, a sort of parliament of the village, where the things are decided collectively by the villagers. People who are from Northeast, they may be familiar too. At the village level, it was the village collective. See, there is definitely dichotomy. In the written history that we are aware of, it has been the monarchy that has been ruling over India for, say, almost 3,000 years or 2,500, 2,700 years. I'm talking about the written history, the known history. But then at the grassroots level, at the village level, at the sub-regional level, it's the people at large who decide their own destiny. The state is mostly concerned with only collection of taxes and revenue. And beyond a point, they could not enforce. I tell you, in the Hind Swaraj, Gandhi is mentioning about one example, and he is learning a lesson from Hind Swaraj. He says Indians have a typical method of protest. If the extortions become beyond tolerance, the people migrate from one village to another village where there is less taxation and more opportunity. Such a fertile land, such a huge land, the population, percentage of population, it is estimated by the historians that during Aurangzeb's time, it was hardly 15 crore. Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, and 15 crore population. Even in Nehru's India, it was 40 crores. If you listen to the lecture of that Red Fort speech of Nehru, 40 crores, is referring time and again 40 crores. So 15 crore population, such a fertile land, hardly population. So everyone had the opportunity to develop, opportunity for their livelihood, survival. So if you go beyond a point to extort as a part of the revenue collection or extra economic oppression, the people had the opportunity to leave the villages of a territory and move to some other principalities or kingdoms territory. Therefore, at the grassroots level, the village had a lot many of the democratic freedom. If you read Dharmpal's beautiful tree, he says that 5% of the taxation was to be spent, collected by the monarchs or the jamindars, was to be spent on the village health, education, etc., etc. So this was part of all the democratic process, part of the governance, part of the cooptation, adaptation. These Kabir, Tulsi, Tiruvalluvar, Narayan Guru, Vemana, Professor Srinivasulu from Osmania University has contributed a paper on Vemana. How these people were reforming the society, or their practices, their vanis, vachanas had impacts on the democratic process in terms of equality, more women, more poor, through their skill upgradations, training programs, dance, music, etc. They were being co-opted. Yes, one thing is noticeable, that the foreign travelers who are coming to India, time and again, across the centuries, they are saying that there is a wide gap between the rich and the poor in Indic traditions. But definitely, the poor had the vast opportunity for social mobility. They were not dying of hunger. Remember, they were in a far, far better positions than any European of the time. I'm talking about the European of the time. One has to contextualize at that point of time. So these are something learning lessons that we need to be taught to the students, what we were.
Thank you, Professor Roy. This gives us a good comparative view on how life was in
Yes.
democratic Bharat versus how things are today, even in comparison to other nations. We have another comment. Professor Himanshu Roy mapped so many aspects of the pre-colonial life in India and debunked many of the myths spread by the colonial masters, which unfortunately prevail today convincingly. I would request him to highlight one of such aspects which he finds more relevant for present times than the rest. I know you already brought up the education related things where we need to teach our history. So that is one. But what else can you think of, sir?
See, the health, very important. Allopathy destroyed the Indic traditions, the homeopathy, sorry, Ayurveda, and the very understanding of not only a physical health, but mental health as well. These are all interlinked. We were not taught in mother language. We were not taught. The medium of instruction was something very, very alien to what we discuss in our homes. So the language of instructions must be which is understood by the students. We see across universities in India, particularly in JNU and DU or Jamia, that the method of communication still is English. And many of the students who are coming from the rural background, doing their master's or MPhil or PhD doctorate, they are not able to understand. If they write in Hindi, they will be far better. They are brilliant minds in terms of idea, but because of the language problem, they are not able to express themselves. So health equally. Civil services. We have to be forced, we must force them. We must celebrate the ideas, not the hierarchies. The kind of hierarchy we have in India among the civil servants, that's pathetic. The one particular IS or Indian Foreign Service or IPS that dominate. As if there are no ideas among the lower ranks people. So the more the opportunities or celebrating the ideas, the ease of doing works, rather than the bureaucratic strangling. Many things can be learned from the pre-colonial civilizations. Health, of course, is therefore I picked up these two aspects because these two are the most basics for a good livelihood and the standard of life and a healthy life.
Absolutely. And with this, this idea of introducing reservation system into the health sector as it is, it's kind of poses many challenges, I think, rather than solutions. So rightly so. Thank you, sir. Any other questions for Professor Roy? Professor Roy, while we wait for, here we are. What can be said about the status of homosexuals back in, the pertinent question, because this has been taken up and kind of blown up in some sense. So maybe you can shed some light on it.
See, if we linked it with liberty and freedom, traditionally, as far as the legality is concerned, the British banned it. It was the British who banned the homosexuality as per the rules are concerned, which is still going on. Some judgments of the high courts or something from the Supreme Court has been there. Earlier, they used to get arrested. In terms of individual freedom, they have the freedom of choice. And we in Indic civilization has been democratic enough to celebrate diversities. When each family has a Kul Devi, family deity or Kul Dev, each village has a different kind of, and we celebrate this diversity. We do not go for tolerating. Tolerance is an alien concept to Indic civilization. We celebrate this diversities, each family, each village, each sub-region. So why can't this individual civic freedom who are part of our citizenship? So as far as the choices are there, I have absolutely no if it's consensual, but that's for the government and the judiciary to decide as far as the legality is concerned.
Okay, thank you. And while we wait for maybe one last question, I will pose one of my questions. Can you please tell us about like what is up for you next? I know that you mentioned another volume. So where are you heading with this? And again, I'll kind of pose this question again. How can kind of students or other people be involved in this process? Thank you.
So sis, the British, some of the questions that was visible on my screen about the tribes, the British deliberately destroyed some of the tribes under the rubric of thugs or criminal tribes. The kind of, they never discussed about the economic loot that they were doing to us. In one incident, I'll tell you, when 1757 in the month of July, it was raining, June or July, when they had captured first time, defeated the Siraj, Nawab of Bengal, and they looted his palace in Murshidabad, which was the capital then, not the Calcutta, but Murshidabad. In 100 boats, they carted away the precious stones and the jewelry. 332 million, something I have written somewhere. Out of which roughly 32 million something was pocketed away by Robert Clive personally. In one incident, they never discussed about these kind of loot. They sucked us dry. They not only looted our resources, but they destroyed altered our history. They colonized our mind. That was the most damaging aspect. They colonized our mind, and still we are not free from that colonizing of the mind. So it's a process of decolonizing. So this criminal tribe that they are talking about, the kind of thuggery that they were talking about, partly their creation. This kind of problem was not there in the pre-British. We never discuss about these kind of, we never heard about in the history, in the pre-British history. It means the problem developed only after the British rule came. That's the point to be noted here. One question, I find something that's coming on the screen that vanished. Something about universities, something it's there.
Yeah, are Indian universities working on research papers with a corrected civilizational discourse in lieu of Western ideology? What is the solution?
Yes, see, very recently we did in Intel University a workshop. We are planning for the next on the decolonizing the narrative on the caste and the gender, and we are trying to accumulate different evidences from different regions of India. Say, for example, Jammu and Kashmir, say, for example, Tamil Nadu or Northwest. And in the first workshop that we had, and in this for the past 4 years that we have been working on these two books, the social thought and the political thought, we came to understand that these were the artificially constructed discourse. So if we go back into the history, pre-colonial history, it will find the solution itself. So my suggestion will be to decolonize this academic narrative through the curriculum that we have. We need to reframe the curriculum in the academia, in the universities and colleges. And better way is to teach and read these excavations, these saint poets, and must be interdisciplinary. We do not, or we should not focus purely on these institutions, elections commissions, and the cabinet, and the party system, and the parliament. This, of course, is one part of the political science, but there are much beyond it into the political science as well, or in any discipline that we need to take account of.
Thank you. I probably the last question we want to take, unless there are others, please quickly put them in. If we want Hindu revival, I believe that the masses need to have some economic incentives for change, like given the times, right? What kind of economic social incentives can be provided?
Hindu revival, say there are different demands and different measures have been taken by a lot many of the you can think of, say for example, something very interesting. In 1916, let me put it in academic framework. In 1916, when Gandhi came to Banaras and visited the Shiv temple, he was horrified to look the dirt around, all around, and he remarked very sarcastically that we Hindus cannot keep our deity clean. What we are going to, what is the standard of the civic life or the Hindu life? And look, in the last 3, 4, 5 years, if you go to Banaras today, the entire landscape has been changed. Some of the estates like Karnataka, they are decontrolling the control of the temples that earlier in 50s and 60s, the governments have tried to control the Hindu temples. If the resources of the Hindu temples are used for the education, health, because this is not secular, that only controlling the resources of the Hindu temples, we are not controlling, the state is not controlling the churches on the mosques. So if the resources of these Hindu temples are used for the education and health, as some of the temples have been in the past, many of the temples in South India, they have been a source of education, dance, then music, then health, etc., education. Similarly, that can be done. So that can, those could be the learning lessons from the history.
Thank you, Professor Roy. One question, which is tangentially related, it's like why the government is not passing a lot of free temples. I don't know if you want to take that, you may or may not. The other question is, you talked about Manusmriti. Was this version we read today, was it created by the British?
See, the Manusmriti was not created by the British, but there are more than one Smriti. Manu wrote only one Smriti. Why to focus on only Manusmriti? There are 5 other important Smritis, and they are all different. As I said, in Indic traditions, in civilizational history, there has been so much of diversities. If Rigved can be of 21 versions, and only 5 versions survives today, 2 in full, 3 in parts, and those 2 in full, they have different shlokas. One has 10,000 something, one has some 11,000 something. Then the shlokas are arranged in different ways. So different number of shloks. Because the Manusmriti suited the British. Unfortunately, we Indians imitated them. We knew, or we thought that only Manusmriti is most important, because the political masters, the British, said so. As I told you, that 1784 Asiatic Society, and how the military officers, the judges, or the civil servants decided in the evening at the time of dinner, from 7 onwards to 8, 8:30, till their dinner was finished, which Smriti, which manuscripts will be published. And the Indians had no role to decide. They acted only as translators. This is something very unfortunate, and unfortunately, or the tragically, we imitated them.
Thank you, Professor Roy. Just concluding remarks now about where to from here for you, for the idea of India, for Indic civilization. So maybe we can bring this to a close. And of course, we will invite you here again, probably in March, as soon as your second volume hits the market.
Anjali, it's a very wide and, pertinent and very poignant way to say, to conclude. But my suggestion to the audience will be that, as I said earlier, that the idea of India is not what Europe says, not what the British said, not what the Europeans, Orientalists, or the Americans or the Canadians say. The idea of India is rooted into pre-colonial India. We have to look into it. I gave you here through presentations just few glimpses. It's much wider, much larger in terms of celebrating the diversities. We do not need to learn to celebrate the diversities from others. We have been existing like that. As I said, each family, each village, each sub-region, etc., etc. In our marriage, if you remember, we talk about Ganga, we talk about Kaveri, we talk about Bharat Varse. So these are something very common. This is not the part of the gift of the British. If you remember our marriage, and if you listen attentively, the different mantras there. So this idea of India has been holistic, existing for centuries, because a highly mobile economy, highly mobile society. Since the economy was sucked dry, we stagnated for almost 10 generations. Therefore, what we think, it's something very distorted. This was not. We need to think afresh. Very difficult task, but nevertheless, with a hard labor, reading of excavations, inscriptions, and the scripts that I told you, local literature accounts, we can reconstruct our history. That will be a salute to the idea of India.
Thank you, Professor Roy. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. This is a book series presented to you as part of the Indology Academy. And Professor Roy, of course, thank you for your honesty, for your scholarship, for all the hard work and all the research that has gone into your multitude of projects. So thank you all again, and we will see you guys next time. Thank you. Sir.
Thank you, Anjali, for all the invitations, and thanks a lot for this Indology Academy. And look forward to see you definitely once. And
Absolutely.
do come to, if you come to India, do meet us.
Absolutely. Yes.
We look forward to host you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Okay. Namaste, everyone. Bye-bye.
Namaste.
Namaste, namaste, everybody. Thank you, Anjali.
Thank you, sir.